Good evening. Good evening, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be back here with you, to be with you in person, all of you who are in person, and welcome to also all of you who are tuning in from home and from ships at sea. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome all of you back to this library company program. I'd like to first thank the American Philosophical Society and Bob Hauser and Patrick Spiro for hosting us here tonight. This is such a wonderful space, and it is a perfect place to think about and celebrate our shared legacy with our shared founder, Ben Franklin. And they have been very generous with us in allowing us the use of this space as a colleague institution, and we're very grateful for it. I also want to thank Rachel Hammer and Alexa Golib. Rachel has been doing everything, has really been running herself ragged over the last few weeks to make sure all of the details of this event come off perfectly, or as close to perfectly as is possible. And I just want to let you know, Rachel and Alexa, Katie is also out there at the front desk. I just want to thank you for all of the work that went into tonight. It's a lot. We haven't done this in a long time, and or it feels like a long time. So there are a lot of old muscles that need to be brought back in. But we had an exhibition opening last week. We have this event tonight. We have our annual dinner coming up at the beginning of December. We have a junto. So there's a lot. So thank you, Rachel, for keeping your head and for getting all this done. This is my, I believe this is my fourth lecture in honor of John Van Horne. I will forever remember, and I'm sure John will always remember, that at my very first lecture, I very blithely and quickly welcomed everyone to the lecture in memory of John Van Horne. Which John was the first person to correct me. He was, the rumors of his departure were greatly exaggerated, and anyway, he was gracious as always in a embarrassing situation. I think more than anyone else here tonight, more than anyone else tuned in, I owe an enormous debt to John. John handed me an organization that was running on all cylinders with a wonderful staff, with a handsome endowment, with an amazing collection. And most of all, John handed to me an organization that had a wonderful and unique culture. And it's the library company's culture. I don't need to tell those of you who are sitting here or tuning in, but I will say it anyway. The library company's culture is a wonderful balance of warmth and friendliness and openness and erudition and intelligence. It is, one of my board members said that when John invited her to join the board, he described it as a merry band. And I think we are still, I hope, a merry band, but certainly it was a merry band. Of course, in Robin Hood, the famous merry band is a group of thieves. You may do with that what you want to do from a philanthropic point of view. But anyway, I owe John an enormous debt, and the library company owes you that debt as well. Again, for this culture, for this wonderful culture, and I think tonight's lecture is a perfect example of that culture, both warm, both friendly, this great learning community that is as erudite as it is welcoming. My job is to thank you all and then to get out of the way, and I've now done it. But before I leave, I do want to say another nice word about another great legacy that John has given to me, which is my board president, Hal Rosenberg. Hal will be introducing our speaker tonight, the great Harold Holzer, who's here to talk in our Presidents in the Press. Hal has been a great friend and advisor and a wonderful leader of the board of the library company. And he is at his best when he is introducing speakers at this event and also at our annual dinner. And so without further ado, I would love to welcome my friend and the president of the board of the library company, Hal Rosenberg.
I thank Mike for those kind words, and I am so happy to see live people at a library company event. It's great not to see you on Zoom. Tonight's speaker is known for his scholarship in journalism, Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, and iconography of Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War. He comes by that quite naturally. He comes by that an editor for the Manhattan Tribune. He then graduated to become press secretary to Congresswoman Bella Abzug when she was on Capitol Hill, and he was her press secretary in her, I believe, failed senatorial and mayoral campaigns. I don't think he had anything at all to do with her hat selections, although I forgot to ask him about that today at lunch. In 1977, he served as press secretary to then mayoral candidate Mario Cuomo. And if memory serves correctly, in 1977, he served as press secretary to then mayoral candidate Mario Cuomo. And if memory serves correctly, I don't think he made it either. But he became a government speechwriter, WNET. From 1984 to 1982, he was special counselor to the Director of Economic Development and Executive Vice President of New York State's Urban Development, and he was appointed to those posts by Mario Cuomo, who was governor at that time and who had succeeded. In 1992, the Metropolitan Museum of Art hired him as communications officer and in relatively quick order promoted him to vice president and then senior vice president for public affairs, to which he was appointed in 2005. He stayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for 23 years. And in 2015 to the present time, he is the Jonathan Fanton Director of Hunter College's Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. It's interesting to note that upon his retirement from the Met, none other than the great Tony Bennett, a personal friend of our speaker and a wonderful singer and a fine artist in his own right, commented on Harold's departure, saying that he was one of the museum's greatest treasures, true Renaissance man. And as you will find, that he is a true Renaissance. He has authored, co-authored, or edited 54 books. He has written over 600 articles for scholarly journals and magazines. He has written more than 60 chapters and forewords for other people's works. He has performed on stage, because he is a Renaissance man. He doesn't just write. He's also performed on stage in a production that he wrote called Lincoln, Seen and Heard. He performed that with Sam Waterston, a well-known actor, a great actor, and how Lincoln ended slavery in America. And one of the venues in which he presented this great theatrical piece was at the White House. And he did it for George W. Bush and First Lady Laura Bush, and of course their guests, and it was also telecast. He has performed that same show with Liam Neeson and Holly Hunter, and I understand that he upstaged both of them. He also performed another stage presentation called Grant, and he did that with Richard Dreyfuss. He has appeared on television. He's been on C-SPAN more than 125 times. He's been on the History Channel, the Today Shows, CNBC, CNN, Fox News, PBS News, CBS Sunday Morning, CBS Evening News. And that's not all. He has lectured at Gettysburg, Oxford, England, the Smithsonian, Harvard, Dartmouth, the American Antiquarian Club, the Museum, New York Historical Society, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's probably 100 other venues that I could name, but then we would never get to, and we would not get to eat dinner as well. He is a friend of presidents. He was appointed in 2000 to the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. In 2010, he became the chairman of its successor once the bicentennial occurred, the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation, and he served in that capacity until 2016. He is currently the chairman of the Lincoln Forum and has been for quite some time. So you might ask yourselves, this all sounds, but I didn't hear anything about movie credits. Did he have anything to do with the movies? Well, I'm afraid he did. Turns out he was the script consultant to Steven Spielberg for his movie Lincoln. Wrote the Young Reader's Companion piece for that. Movie. So, after all that stuff, you might ask yourself, well, the guy had a full-time job for 23 years at the Met, and he started writing books in 1984. Where in the world did he find the time to do this? And as it turns out, there are weekends, Saturdays and Sundays. And according to a Wall Street Journal interview that he gave, he wrote from 8:30 to 5:30 every Saturday and Sunday during the time that he had his full-time occupation. His works on Lincoln have been critics and, of course, the general reading public. In 2015, he won the coveted Gilder-Lehrman Prize, History Prize from Columbia School of Journalism, and two other prizes, major prizes, book, Lincoln and the Power of the Press. In 2005, he was for Lincoln at the Cooper Union, the speech that made Abraham Lincoln president, along with several other prestigious awards for that book. His book, President-Elect Lincoln and the Great Secession Winter, won Morians and critics as a stunning and original work which shed new light on the most turbulent and critical transition in American history. The first most critical transition in American history. He is a 7-time winner of the Baroness Lincoln Award of the Civil War Roundtable of New York. He was awarded the highest honor bestowed by the state of Illinois, the Order of Lincoln. He won the George Washington Medal from the Freedom Foundation. He won the prestigious Nevins Freeman Award of the Civil War Roundtable of Chicago. And in 2008, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Bush. His latest book, Presidents versus the Press, The Endless Battle Between the White House and the Media, From the Founding Fathers to Fake News, has been praised, and I can tell you as a member of the general public, members of the general public as well. A Secretary of the Navy once said of the press, "Scarcely one of them has regard for truth, and nearly all make sure of their positions to subserve selfish mercenary ends." And I know you're thinking, well, that was probably Richard Spencer, Trump's Secretary of the Navy. But it wasn't. It was Gideon Welles, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy. And that conflict with the press, of course, is going to be, of presidents in the press, is not only the subject of his book, but I believe the subject of his talk tonight. Most presidents, if not all, want to be favorably. They have to have some idea about who Lincoln was and what he did. Inevitably, in modern days, one of their stops along that road to discovery is a meeting with Harold Holzer. It gives me great pleasure to present our lecturer in honor, not in memory, in honor of John Van Horne, advisor to presidents, advisor to Steven Spielberg, advisor to the U.S. Constitution Center, as well as other great institutions, and now advisor to us, the friends and members of the Library Company.
I should really just leave at this point, because that was, I heard things that I haven't heard in years, or I never heard that thing from Tony Bennett saying I was a treasurer of the Met. I may have made it up at the time myself. Thank you, Hal, and thank you to Michael and Rachel and everyone who has been so kind to me today. It's been wonderful all day seeing some old friends from this town, and also seeing the Library Company and some treasures that the curators were kind enough to put out for me to see. What an institution. And I want to echo what you said, Hal. It is an extraordinary thing to be facing live people, including John Van Horne, who I'm glad is here, and I'm so honored to be giving this lecture that has been created in your honor. It's, but as the comedians say, it's good to be anywhere. This is this book was published in the end of August of 2020. I've made no personal appearances. I've done endless Zooms. It's not the same. It was wonderful. I spoke to the National Press Club, and I spoke to prestigious institutions and groups. This is better. Seeing you is it's infinitely more exciting to face an audience again. And boy, I hope it stays this way. I know we all do, and glad you're all beginning to come back at the Library Company. So my news today is that I'm not going to talk about Lincoln, maybe at the end if I have time. I'm really going to, these guys here are the inspiration. And this piano, I will tell you, is very intimidating, but I won't get into that. Obviously, when we think of presidents doing battle with the press, as they have done for so long, we probably think first of the free-for-alls within the White House that we see on television, or that we've heard about in the White House briefing room or in the East Room. Recent presidents jousting with the press or battling with the press in public. We think of shouted questions by the press as presidents enter and leave rooms. Questions by the press as president. I don't know if you heard the most recent flap between presidents and the press is that when President Biden was meeting with Boris Johnson, I think, at the UN in New York yesterday, or the sweeping squad, I think they're sometimes called, ushered the press out of the room, and now they filed a protest because no American journalist, I think they're sometimes called, ushered the press out of the room, and now they filed a protest because no American journalist got to ask a question. It was just really very fast. But anyway, obviously there have been relationships before the modern era, before reporters were doing as much performing as they do today before the cameras. In the early days of the American presidency, when the capital of the United States was right here in this city, on the one hand, things were calmer and statelier, I would say, at least when it came to face-to-face confrontations. But the point I want to make during the Trump and Biden eras, different in some ways, in many ways, but the same in many ways. And the point I make in my book is that the first president to complain about fake news was the first president, who actually used the expression false news in one of his indirect letters, different in some ways, in many ways, but the same in many ways. And the point I make in my book is that the first president to complain about fake news was the first president, who actually used the expression false news in one of his is that as an iconic figure in his own lifetime, well before his presidency, as a man who was elected unanimously to the presidency, he was just not used to criticism. And in New York and later here in Philadelphia, he was kind of spoiled by the first 3 years of press coverage that he received, generally as laudatory as he had been used to receiving during his military career. And then something happened in Philadelphia while the Capitol was being built in Washington. Something absolutely changed around the 3rd year of George Washington's first term with the press. And before I tell you what it was, I mean, it's not going to be a mystery, it was, you know, an era of bad feelings. But before I tell you how it developed, I just want to remind you of what I mean by the press, because now it's a term that we conflate with the media, and in the Washington era, of course, it was literally the press. Big broadsheets. They were not dailies in the Washington era. They, at first, here in Philadelphia, came out once, and then in good times, they came out twice a week. They were published and edited by writer entrepreneurs, or sometimes, Franklin is an example, printer entrepreneurs. Editor-publishers came from both of those specialties, either writing or printing. A lot of them were printed on hand crank presses or early steam presses, and they were distributed through the only conveyance that could get material reliably and routinely out of the Capitol, and that is the U.S. mail. In fact, George Washington, when he first became president, recommended a discount for newspaper, for the postal rates for newspapers, and journalists were very pleased. It didn't work in Congress. Newspapers were very pleased, and I think that that added to his assumption that he would be their darling forever. So what most readers got was not really news, as we would call it, or even, it wasn't newsworthy by our standards. Reports could come days after the events they described, or even weeks if people live far from the principal publishing centers of the country. Newspapers often reprinted reports from Europe. Clearly, they didn't get them from the transatlantic cable. They got them from European newspapers that were delivered in ports like New York and Philadelphia. And they were, at the very least, dated and often out of date by the time they arrived. Yet when they were adapted and reprinted in American newspapers, they had all the immediacy and excitement, I guess, of a presidential tweet or a CNN news alert. They were considered extremely timely. So by our standards, slow, cumbersome, a little bit out of date. By the standards of the 1790s, breathtakingly immediate. And let me take into account the political aspect of newspaper publishing, beginning in the late period of the first Washington term. Newspapers were unabashedly political, beginning in Washington and on through Adams and Jefferson. And in that era, the papers were either run by strong and unapologetic Federalists or Democratic Republicans. I'm just going to say Democrat for the rest of this evening to keep it a little shorter. And of course, this group knows what separated those political beliefs. The Federalists were kind of pro-national authority, favored the British in foreign policy, to some degree anti-slavery, while the Democrats believed in state rights, and they tilted toward France and generally committed to preserving the institution of slavery. And newspapers became, at this period, deeply intertwined with political organizations. So here's George Washington admonishing against political parties, but political parties and newspapers developing alliances that lasted till the 1890s, really, when journalism changed again. Newspapers became part of political organizations. Washington kept saying he wanted the printers, as he called them at the beginning, to be more discreet. Well, that wasn't what they were after that 3-year honeymoon had passed, and Washington enjoyed the longest press honeymoon of any American president. I was remembering a line that I did not learn about in time to include in my book. It's not about the founders, it's about Jimmy Carter. Jody Powell, everybody remember him? Jimmy Carter's press secretary, was once asked whether he thought that President Carter had a genuine press honeymoon. And Powell said he didn't even get a one-night stand. So Washington got 3 years of honeymoon. And he was living, I guess, in a, without being insulting, he was living in a kind of a fool's paradise because the newspapers were becoming more and more politically oriented. But the government news, official government news, was published in a Philadelphia newspaper called the Gazette of the United States. It was published by a journalist named John Ward Fenno, and it reliably published news of the Washington administration. It often contained anonymous or pseudonymous editorials, clearly the work of Alexander Hamilton, who would soon found his own newspaper in New York City. And it reigned supreme as a source. It wasn't very successful. It had, in the end, like 2,000 subscribers at the very end, although in those days, newspapers did not have one reader or even a family of two. They were read and given to family members and sometimes even sent through the mail to relatives who had moved from one region, perhaps south or west. So they had a larger circulation, but it was still very modest. Hamilton made sure the paper got official government printing contracts to make sure that Fenno got by. But its dominance wasn't destined to last. And it was George Washington's own Secretary of State, who I see watching over my shoulder, who concluded, even though he was serving in the administration, that news coming out of Philadelphia exclusively from Federalist newspapers was inherently flawed. So he, and I keep emphasizing, he was the Secretary of State for Washington, he convinced a New York editor named Philip Frenno, and I never know how that is supposed to be pronounced. I don't think anybody knows how it's supposed to be pronounced. There is a Philadelphia artist whose painting of Lincoln is at the Union League, and for years I called him Edward Dalton Marchant, and I wasn't sure whether it should have been Marchant. But a descendant got in touch with me after I had been writing about him for 30 years or so, and he said, I just want you to know it's pronounced Marchant. So again, Frenno is just a guess at this point. So he was a New York Democratic editor, and Jefferson said, come on down to Philadelphia and start a rival paper to George Washington. Frenno hated the British. He had been a prisoner of war on board a British ship during the Revolution in New York Harbor. And so he started a newspaper here called the National Gazette. Jefferson's justification was no government ought to be free of censors, and where the press is free, no one ever will. Of course, we know all of the great sentiments he expressed about the press. If he had to choose government without a free press or free press without government, he would choose the free press. I assure you that in later life he assailed newspapers constantly. They once asked him, long after his retirement to Monticello, what he read now in newspapers, and he said, only the advertisements, because they're the only truth you can find in a newspaper. But suddenly, by Jefferson's intervention, Philadelphia had two editors, ironically, with similar sounding names, right? Fenno and Frenno, publishing two newspapers with similar sounding names, the Gazette of the United States and the National Gazette. I don't think it confused many people, because if you were a Democrat, you read the National Gazette. If you were a Federalist, you read the Gazette of the United States. By the way, to even the odds about survival, commercial survival with Jefferson got Frenno a job in the State Department as a translator, a French translator, I think for $200 a year, which was, I guess, enough. Hamilton charged that Frenno only translated things that vilified Washington, but it didn't matter. So all of a sudden, with Frenno in the mix and Democratic papers on the rise elsewhere in the country, but this is here in the capital, the unsullied and seemingly unsullyable Washington was subject to the kind of criticism that he had never endured. And needless to say, he didn't like it. Not only did he favor the British, said this new newspaper, he was himself a dictator. He wanted to be a monarch. He traveled around Philadelphia, about Philadelphia, in an ornate carriage like a king. He insisted on a public celebration of his own birthday. I always wondered where that started. I guess it started here in Philadelphia. It got worse. He filed false expense reports. That was a pretty tough charge against a man whose integrity was so valuable to him. But you know, Washington didn't take a salary. He filed expense reports, and the Frenno paper said they were exaggerated. When he went off personally to lead the resistance to the Whiskey Rebellion, he actually broke the law by leaving the Capitol during a time when the Congress was in session, which apparently was rigorously enforced. He was responsible for a financial downturn which Jefferson believed he hadn't been held accountable for. And the Frenno paper added, he was a reprehensible symbol of the United States because he was a slave owner. That really irritated Washington, not because he was not an owner of human beings, but because no mention was made of the same sin being committed by Thomas Jefferson. And so it went. By the way, Frenno, to taunt, every time Washington objected to one of these articles, privately, but word got back, Frenno would add another subscription to the executive mansion. So Washington, by the time he was complaining routinely, was getting 4 copies of the paper delivered every day. And it really, he said it was an impudent design to insult him. Jefferson was present and wrote in his private diary at a cabinet meeting at which George Washington looked at a caricature, a pasquinade, as Jefferson called it, showing him being led to the guillotine by the French. And as Jefferson, I think, probably smilingly observed, Washington threw it to the floor of the executive mansion, and as Jefferson wrote, got into, he stomped it with his boot, I shouldn't have left that out, and got into one of those passions when he cannot control himself. For his part, Washington thought that dissension in the press would convince foreigners that the American experiment was failing. But he also confided that he was distressed with the personal abuse which was being bestowed upon him. That's a quote. And as he said, I defy any man on earth to produce one single act of mine. Oh, actually, I should say it the way he said it, which is in the third person. One single act of his, meaning the executive, since he has been in the government, which was not done on the purest motives, adding that by God, he would rather be on his farm or in the grave than in the presidency. Reading Washington's tortured responses is a chore in a way, although it's illuminating, because he never spoke about himself as an ordinary person. It was always the executive who was being insulted, not himself. John Adams was always blunter. He said the hellhounds are in full cry against the president in the newspapers. Well, it was a bad end for the man Washington called that rascal Frenno. In 1793, an earlier epidemic, yellow fever, overtook Philadelphia. And although Frenno was not a victim of it, his readers, those who had survived, fled into the countryside, and his newspaper went out of business. You would have thought that Washington would have breathed a huge sigh of relief. If he did, it was very temporary, because by then, Frenno's paper had been replaced by a man named Benjamin Franklin Bache. Is it Bache or Bache? Okay, that name, I guess, I'm happy to hear. And of course, he was the grandson of your founder. I tried to find out a reliable source of the enmity between George Washington and the grandson of someone he knew so well, his co-founder. Apparently, there was a cabinet meeting at which something was said about Benjamin Franklin in Washington's presence. And it was reported to Bache, to young Bache, that the president had not said, "This is an outrage against my friend, I will not abide by this." He said nothing, which was Washington's way. Bache, who had been trained in printing by Franklin, educated in France by Franklin, was devoted to his grandfather and really wanted to be in the publishing business himself, quickly became George Washington's severest critic, with a newspaper published in Philadelphia, which had a very long name, but we can just call the Aurora. It came out as reliably as the Sun, hence its name. And Bache suddenly denounced Washington's stately journeying through the American continent in search of personal incense. Now George Washington had a new press enemy to denounce for impertinence. And now they argued about real issues like the ratification of the Jay Treaty with the British. But Washington always felt he was being subjected to what he called the grossest and most insidious misrepresentation in such exaggerated and indecent terms as could scarcely be applied to a Nero, a notorious defaulter, or even a common pickpocket. Washington did not make that public. He never made these objections public. He confided them to correspondents, including Jefferson, although he never said to Jefferson, "This is all your fault. You started this." He complained to him, I think assuming that Jefferson could, though he would not, change the course of that kind of coverage. Even Alexander Hamilton thought that these relentless attacks were going to do injury to Washington's reputation ultimately. As he put it, and I think it's a great quote, "Just as drops of water will impress in time the hardest marble." And Washington, of course, was the original marble man. So I think that after a second term of these denunciations, that this new press culture was one of the significant reasons that George Washington decided not to seek a third term. I know we buy into, and I do too to a certain extent, the kind of Cincinnatus narrative that he wanted to set an example, as indeed he did by returning to civilian life and yielding a power to a successor, the kind of thing that we all took for granted for so long, yielding power. But I think partly it was because of the press coverage. And he got even, in a sense. He got even with his farewell address. And for some reason, he decided not to give the farewell address to his loyal newspaper editor, Fenno, or the Gazette of the United States. Instead, he summoned David Claypool, the editor of kind of an apolitical Philadelphia paper called the American Daily Advertiser, summoned him to the executive mansion. Now, Claypool had never been inside of the executive mansion, and for maybe at a reception, but had never had a personal invitation from the president. He was flabbergasted. The date was Friday, September 16th, so right around this time of year, 1796. And he told the astonished editor he was giving him exclusive rights to his farewell address, all 32 manuscript pages. Washington explained that he wanted a newspaper that was never stained with the ribaldry and violence of party recirculation. I love the way he said things. And the editor of Washington said, I want to read the galleys, or whatever term was used, the proofs. And audaciously, Claypool said, may I keep the manuscript? And I think it's in the New York Public Library today. I don't know what the ownership track is, but yes, Washington said you can keep the manuscript. And in one earlier version of the famous farewell address, Washington finally publicly addressed press attacks, albeit in this same kind of strangulating literary style through which he had expressed, or maybe the word is concealed himself for so long. There was still no direct criticism. Washington would take note, as he said, of press abuse without really exacting revenge. But it's not hard to read the anger between the lines. This is what he wrote in the farewell address. As some of the gazettes of the United States have teemed with the invective that disappointment, ignorance of facts, and malicious falsehoods could invent to misrepresent my policies and affections, to wound my reputation and feelings, and to weaken, if not entirely destroy, that confidence you had been pleased to repose in me, speaking to the general public, it might be expected at the parting scene of my public life that I should take some notice of such virulent abuse. But as here, which he just did, obviously, but as heretofore, I shall pass over them in utter silence, never having myself, nor by any other with my participation or knowledge, written or published a scrap in answer to any of them. That was pretty good stuff. But guess what? Alexander Hamilton, who some say drafted, but may only have edited the farewell address, Washington would send it to him in the mail and then would get sent back. I find that astonishing, but anyway. Hamilton said, cut it out, take it all out. It's too crybaby. I'm sure he didn't use that expression. He even made him take out a statement where he said he has more gray hairs than he did when he became president. Hamilton said, take that out. We don't, it's too, you're asking for sympathy. So the attempt to settle old scores with the press did not make it into the farewell address, except for some vague reference to the baneful effects of the spirit of party. The address to the people of the United States appeared in Philadelphia on September 19th, 1796, shorn of its comments on the press. And of course, as Washington well knew, despite its name, well, he called it Address to the People, but it really was a statement for the newspapers. In fact, I found an interesting Washington letter in which he worried to Hamilton about the length of it because he wanted it to be, he said that all the columns of a large gazette would scarcely, I conceive, contain the present draft. And he was right. There was a jump, as we call it in the newspaper business. But as he said, he couldn't imagine his valedictory appearing in any other form, except in this one kind of apolitical newspaper. And of course, it caused an absolute sensation. It was reprinted in Philadelphia that very day. Must have been a very hard thing to do because there was no pool reporting, quite the Herculean typesetting feat. And eventually it appeared in every newspaper in the country, even if it took months for the most remotely located. Interestingly, advertising still took the front page of a newspaper. That was where the advertisements were, and they did not yield to the story of the actually dwindling century. The farewell address appeared on the inside. Now, you would have thought Washington's out, Bache is getting what he wanted, which is a competitive election in which his guy, Thomas Jefferson, had a reasonable chance to succeed George Washington. But, you know, and this is very similar to today, when Donald Trump remains an issue that is useful to the Democratic Party, as Governor Newsom just proved, I think, in California. Bache thought that Washington should remain the issue, even though one would think John Adams would be an easy, well, they didn't know he would be the nominee, but it was assumed he would be the leading candidate of the Federalists. I shouldn't say nominee, it wasn't that way then, but Bache continued to pound Washington. And Washington wrote, even as he was leaving office, packing up, about the outrageous and odious articles, and they followed him all the way back to Mount Vernon. And Bache went so far as to publish a letter that Thomas Paine had sent to Washington from France, where he was in self-imposed exile. He had been arrested there without a word, he thought, of sympathy or protest from America's first president. So he wrote and said to Washington that he was both treacherous in private friendship and a hypocrite in public life. Are you an apostate or an impostor? I don't know whether you've abandoned your principles or whether you ever had any. Wow. Washington called it the most insulting letter he ever received, and it didn't remain private for long. Washington, after its appearance, he said, I think there's too much confidence and perhaps personal regard for the present chief magistrate, meaning me, he could not bring himself to say me, for its publication to really prove injurious. But it hurt him again. And this was after he was leaving office, or while he was actually departing. By the way, whether or not it was planned, Thomas Jefferson later sent a warship, an American warship, to France to retrieve Thomas Paine and bring him back to the United States. As it happened, I think Paine thought he was still under threat of arrest, so he didn't want to take a commercial ship. But he did take a commercial ship, and Jefferson entertained him openly, was seen with him on the lawn of the White House when he returned. 2 days before Christmas of 1796, Bache's Aurora unleashed a farewell message of its own, probably the work of a newly hired pro-Republican Democratic pamphleteer named James Callender. Then in the early stages of a brief, but as it would turn out, impactful career as an anti-federalist, and later an anti-democrat. I'll tell you briefly when I finish how he changed stripes. And this is what Callender wrote. If ever a nation was debauched by a man, the American nation has been debauched by Washington, all caps. Let his conduct be an example to future ages. Let it serve as a warning that no man may be an idol, and that people may confide in themselves, and that a people may confide power in themselves rather than in an individual. Even now he reacted only privately, saying, although he is soon, he being him, to become a private citizen, his opinions are to be knocked down and his character reduced as low as they are capable of sinking it, even by resorting to absolute falsehoods. It's maddening, really. One just wants to hear Washington complain about fake news openly, but he never does it. And then the Aurora, again, this is now getting into 1797, still not done with Washington. It exhumed 20-year-old letters from Washington that supposedly called into question his loyalty during the Revolution. Can you imagine anything as wounding? These had been long before exposed as fakes. Washington writes, if you read the Aurora of this city, or those gazettes which are under the same influence, you cannot but have perceived with what malignant industry and persevering falsehoods I am assailed. At last, He says, I, myself, I was almost relieved to see him finally changing to the first person in order to weaken, if not destroy, the confidence of the public, to attach principles to me which every action of my life have given the life to. But even that is no stumbling block, he said, with the editors of these papers and their supporters, and now knowing that I had determined not to take notice of such attacks, they are pressing the matter upon the public mind with more avidity than usual, urging that my silence is proof of their genuineness. I never wrote or even saw one of these letters until they issued in print. And then he said of Beish, even in the terse medium of Twitter, I don't think anybody ever dismissed a journalist as well. He said, this man has celebrity in a certain way, for his calumnies are to be exceeded only by his impudence, and both stand unrivaled. He wrote his final complaints on March 3rd, 1797, hours before he was to relinquish the presidency to John Adams. Such immense pains have been taken by this Mr. Beish to disseminate these counterfeit letters that he had no choice but to finally speak publicly. So in the end, he wrote a letter to outgoing Secretary of State Thomas Pickering. He authorized Pickering to denounce the letters as forgeries, which Pickering did. The disavowal came out, but as Washington learned, and of course everything he did and endured was the first, he learned that the press would always have the last word. And 2 days after he had returned to private life, on March 6th, the Aurora launched a final torrent of invective, labeling Washington the source of all the misfortunes of the country. It celebrated the fact that he was no longer possessed of the power to multiply his evils in the United States. If ever there is a period for rejoicing, this is the moment. And then he said, during the French and Indian Wars, Washington had fired on a truce party. So there was one more calumny. Finally, John Ward Fenno tried to have the final word. Washington's old official spokesman said that a man who was born in America and is part of the great family of the United States, meaning Benjamin Franklin Beish, should thus basely aim his poisoned dagger at the father of his country is sorely to be lamented. Now, had Washington been a vindictive man, or easily discernible as a vindictive man, he might have taken some pleasure about what befell his press nemesis, a man who he might have said, "You're a very nasty person," in a press conference, as Donald Trump occasionally did to some of his press questioners, not even critics. In April 1797, right here in this city at a dockyard, a shipbuilder's son assaulted Benjamin Franklin Beish for attacking George Washington. Soon thereafter, John Ward Fenno's son encountered Beish on a Philadelphia street, and lunged at him for insulting his father. This is John Fenno Jr. Beish got the best of things that time. He struck young Fenno over the head with a cane. And the press violence, which again was to continue throughout the 19th century, on into the Lincoln era, which I can chat about in questions if you have any. The veterans of Washington's old army hurled a rock through the office of the Aurora, and then marched on Beish's home and menaced his family. Again, these outbursts foreshadowed this violent escalation in relations between the press and politics, between Democrats ultimately and Whigs and then Republicans. By the way, our friend Beish died again of yellow fever, the second wave, in 1798. He was only 29 years old. Washington outlived him. And I will end the official part. Well, I should do a postscript about Callender, but I will say that Washington, in his final years, and there weren't many at Mount Vernon, even when his throat was severely wounded by whatever cold, pneumonia, whatever it was that he caught at the end of his life, he would sit in a chair in his parlor reading from newspapers aloud. And that brings us to, I'll do the final piece about Jefferson, who, again, he loved newspapers that loved him. He hated newspapers that hated him, and who's different, right? Trump hated CNN, and Biden is not crazy about Fox. 'Twas ever thus. But Jefferson, the idea then, and Washington and Jefferson knew this, was to reward your friends and keep your enemies impoverished if you could. Hence, Fenno's paper got Federalist and official government printing, and the State Department behind Washington's back gave Fenno a subvention, a job, so that he could publish an opposition paper. So Mr. Callender, who had written those pretty mean things, I mean, over-the-top things about George Washington, he ended up in Richmond. And when Jefferson did become president in 1801, he did what any smart journalist would do. He applied for a federal job. Now, I should add, or as a prequel, he had been imprisoned in Richmond under the Sedition Act, which was Adams's answer to press criticism from Democrats. The answer was to make it a federal crime, despite the First Amendment, to criticize or ridicule a president. And that unleashed really a reign of terror against Democratic editors. The cases were heard only in the federal judiciary, and every federal jurist at the time had been appointed by a Federalist. Every federal judge had been appointed, including the Supreme Court, by a Federalist. So newspaper men and women, particularly women who had inherited newspapers from their late husbands, were imprisoned, fined, shut down. I think Lincoln, in a way, did it one better, but we can talk about that in questions. So Callender was in prison in Richmond. He wrote some absolutely vile letters from Richmond about the fact that it was an integrated prison, and he found that the worst punishment of all. So, in a way, to hell with him. But he gets out of prison, and he writes to Jefferson. He says, I want to be postmaster of Richmond. Jefferson could have really done it, and he would have done himself and his reputation an enormous favor had he given Callender this job. It was a plum job, but it routinely went to federal, to supportive newspapermen. Washington, something about him at this stage irked Jefferson. By the way, Jefferson had contributed $50 to his legal defense fund when he was on trial under the sedition laws. He said no, did not want to give Callender the postmaster's job. And I'm sure most of you know what how Fenno exacted his revenge. He wrote the first pamphlet in which he accused, I say accused because many people did not believe it at the time, accused Jefferson of having a long-time affair with an enslaved very young woman, and being the father of children who are children of color who bear. I mean, he wrote it in very taunting phrases. So it was, again, might have avoided the exposure, but I don't know, sometimes people who do terrible things think they'll never be caught. So that was the end of Jefferson's relationship with Callender, whom he damned to his final day. I would be remiss if I didn't say one thing about Abraham Lincoln, and that it always gives me a special thrill to be so close to the spot, I guess it's right outside that door, maybe a little bit to the right, where Abraham Lincoln raised the flag on Washington's birthday, 1861, celebrating the addition of a new state to the Union, rather than the subtraction of the states that had seceded to protect the institution of slavery. Right at a hotel only a couple of blocks from here, not quite as close as the hotel that Rachel put me in, but pretty close. He had gotten word the night before that there was a credible assassination plot awaiting him in Baltimore, which is why, again, right outside here, Abraham Lincoln famously said of Independence Hall, and in a way this entire city, I would rather be assassinated on this spot than to surrender it. So again, it's wonderful to be in front of you, wonderful to be back in Philadelphia, and sorry I only got to Jefferson and barely that in this talk. It's a long book, but I'd be happy to answer any of your questions, and I thank you very much for your attention.
We do have, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Harold, for a fantastic talk. I'm going to stand down here so I can run around the microphones a little more easily.
Thank you.
We have some microphones. This will help those who are tuning in remotely to hear your questions. Does anyone have a question?
In your estimation, which president had the best relationship with the press?
That's a great question. So I'm going to discount the 19th century because, again, you know, Jackson loved his Democratic editors and made them part of his kitchen cabinet, and he hated the anti-Jackson editors, and Lincoln befriended John Wayne Horne of Philadelphia and others who were supporters, and, you know, allowed the imprisonment of those who were anti-enlistment, anti-draft. But I think both Roosevelts had terrific relationships with the press. So this is after the political party era of newspapers. Newspapers were after news. And Teddy invented this idea of meeting the press directly and personally, and he did so in little office off the Oval Office, a little hallway, which achieved some notoriety in later years. But anyway, he would get shaved every day by his barber, and during that period, he would invite the White House correspondents, who by then had their own room, to come in and ask him questions off the record. Everything was off the record. And the press was irritated after. I mean, they loved him. He was great copy. That's all they cared about. It wasn't political. But they were a little irked about his saying that everything was off the record unless they asked him afterwards whether they could put it on, and then he would invariably rewrite stuff himself. So they would purposely ask him the most difficult or enraging questions when the barber had the straight-edge razor at his neck, because they knew he would jump up. And they said they never drew blood, but they never stopped trying. But again, great copy, so they liked him. FDR was extremely controlling, but he held 998 news conferences in 12 years and a month. And the banter that I found in the transcripts, especially the banter in the beginning of each press conference, was charming and entertaining. On the negative side, I will say that this probably applied, and I think it's absolutely fair to say, to friendship from white male reporters. There are only a couple of women that I've been able to identify who attended these press conferences, one of whom was May Craig, who later became famous in the Kennedy era as the little old lady with the flower pot hat. Do you remember the Kennedy? When Kennedy was lagging, he would call on her, and she would always ask a strange question, and he would just smile and say, "Very easy today, Ms. Craig," and everybody would laugh. It was a great entertainment, although she asked a famous question about Mary McLeod Bethune once that threw him off, but that's another story. Women generally were in Eleanor's press conference. She had 500 press conferences of her own. They had rivaling, bantering press conferences. And there was no reporter of color in any press conference of Franklin Roosevelt's until 1944. That's 11 years after he became president. And I guess I knew it, but I was still shocked by it when I read it. And you know, his White House was controlled by Southerners, really. And his press secretary, the first person to ever hold that title, I think, his name was Stephen Early. I'd always known that name because he was considered, you know, he was a press secretary for, I think, 12 years, and then a few months under Truman, and then he came back when Truman's press secretary died. He was the great nephew of a Confederate general, and he kept the black press out like a Confederate general, unfortunately. And his excuse was, I know I'm rambling a bit here, but it's such an interesting question of who was favored, and there's always a caveat. He kept the black press out because he said, we only have room in the White House for daily newspapers. And of course, the black press was really a weekly press in those days, as was John Ward Fenno, for goodness sake. Anyway, that was his excuse. Finally, the black weeklies got together and created I think it was called the Negro News Service at the beginning, and they got a guy, I think his name was McAlpin, to be the first correspondent. So Stephen Early ran out of excuses, and FDR greeted him, you know, from his desk, welcome McAlpin, but it had been a long time coming. So again, those were the two, I think, most popular with white male reporters who were the principal body of reporters. I was astonished at how many reporters disliked Barack Obama. I thought that was my biggest find in the book. On the other side of the coin, they found him very secretive, and they were insulted that he wiretapped two reporters named Risen and Rosen, which made it hard to tell the story because of the connecting names, early in the administration, and their families. So, of course, none of the reporters think that now, but they did write it, so I told the story. I promise I'll be shorter if I get another question.
Yeah, I just want to make a little comment that Mr. Bache came by fake news honestly because Mr. Franklin Dr. Franklin up there, our founder at the APS, was also a purveyor of fake news.
Well, he trained at his feet, for sure. Yeah, sure. Since you didn't get a rise out of me.
Yeah. It was during his time in France during the Revolutionary War when he was hustling to get more support from France and perhaps other European powers that he imported a press and created his own little newspaper and when he was living in Passy and wrote an item about a slaughter of Americans by some Indian tribe that was completely faked, and helped to rouse European support for the revolutionary cause. And it became so well known that it actually, as like other news stories that you mentioned, made its way to the United States, even though it was completely false.
That absolutely is a great story, and now you've gotten a rise out of me. That was terrific. I wish I'd included it. Thank you.
Sir, given what you said about John Adams and his relationship with the press, how did that carry over to his son, to John Quincy Adams, who was literally the second Northern president, right? And so how did those two things interact and so on?
So when Adams runs against Jackson, it was some of the rough, it rivaled Adams-Jefferson in terms of press, partisan press coverage and criticism and scandal mongering. And most people know the story about press reports from the anti-Jackson side that Rachel Jackson was not legally married to the general, and which technically was true because she hadn't gotten a final divorce decree before marrying Jackson. And you know, the myth is that the scandal killed her, She died in Tennessee and did not get to come to Washington as First Lady, which of course made Jackson totally crazy and hating the anti-Jackson press even more. But I look back at the coverage of Adams, the second Adams, by the Jackson press, and it was brutal. And they, by the way, wrote that Adams's wife, Louisa, right, was slept with him before they were married. And that was a pretty sensational thing to write in those days. And that, of course, attacking her as a foreign-born aspirant to this exalted position, we've seen that recur with Melania, I guess, to some degree. So it was brutal on both sides. And Adams, you know, had been a representative of his father, so he carried all of those press biases and what is the word I'm searching for? Grudges that came out of the Adams family. He sent his son to Congress one day with a message, and as the son got right to the middle of the rotunda of the Capitol, a journalist belted him and knocked him down. And then his son started excluding journalists from the White House Christmas parties. So it was rough, and it was one of the roughest relations. Although if you look again at what evolved into the Whig Party press, they were okay with Jackson, at least the northern element of the Whig Party. Again, the Whigs were so factionalized that he lost the favor of the Calhounites and the other Southerners.
Well, Harold, I think, again, I'd like to thank you. Thank you for taking these questions, and thank you again for a wonderful presentation. I have been remiss in not mentioning, yes, please.
Thank you.
I didn't mention that Harold will be signing copies of his book in the back of the room. So copies of his book are available for sale for anyone here, and he will be signing them. Otherwise, thank you all again for coming tonight. Thank you for this wonderful kind of restoration. I don't know, that's a big word, but thanks for coming, and thanks for being here in person. It's good to see all of you. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon, I hope at our annual dinner coming up in December, perhaps at our Junto, and again in the future. So again, thank you and good night.